All right, we carry on with our study of 1 Timothy. I do want to say that I'm praying for all of you and hope you're doing well, and I miss being able to gather with you. 1 Timothy, we carry on in chapter 3. Paul gives instructions about church leaders. He does that probably because the false teaching had created an actual or an anticipated leadership crisis. So I think that's why he brings this up. And in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 3, he lays out for Timothy and for the church the standards to which overseers, also known as elders and shepherds, but he lays out the standards to which overseers are to conform. And the first qualification he gives is that an overseer is to be the husband of one wife. Now, this is probably the most controversial of the qualifications. The phrase is literally a husband of one wife, or you could render it a man of one woman. But those words, they're open to various interpretations. I'm going to address briefly the more common interpretations that are given, and then I'll let you know where I come down on my understanding of it. Now, a few people think Paul is saying that an elder cannot be a polygamist, that he must be the husband of one wife rather than multiple wives. In other words, that's the focus. He's saying he cannot be a polygamist. And though I think polygamy is indirectly excluded by what Paul is saying, it's doubtful that he's expressly addressing polygamy here. And by this time, monogamy, that was the generally accepted norm in Greco-Roman and Jewish cultures, and there's no evidence that polygamy was an issue in Christian communities. So it seems very unlikely that Paul would be focusing on that. I mean, it just wasn't a concern at that time. Moreover, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9, Paul requires widows who are to be enrolled on the list. Presumably it's a list of church support, but he requires the widows who are to be enrolled on the list to be a wife of one husband, or the wife of one husband, or the woman, you could render it the woman of one man, using the identical phrase in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, except for the gender reversal. So that's significant. You see, the phrase there in 1 Timothy 5:9, it can't be intended to exclude women who had multiple husbands, polyandry. It can't be intended to exclude that because that practice was unknown in that culture. So we know there he's not saying you can't have multiple husbands. So when you flip it around in 1 Timothy 3:2, he's not saying you can't have multiple wives. Of course you can't, but that's an indirect thing rather than something he's addressing directly. Now some think that the phrase is a way of saying that an elder must be married, that he must have a wife. And though Paul assumes that an elder will be married and that he'll have a family, I don't think he's mandating that here. He doesn't say that an elder must be married or that he must have a wife. The emphasis is on his being a husband of one wife or a man of one woman. As the word one, that's the first word in that phrase. So that's the emphasis. It's on the one. And in addition, if this understanding of the phrase, if you take it that it means he must be married, if you understand it that way, if you then apply that understanding to the counterpart in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9, it leaves Paul uttering a tautology. You see that only widows who had been married could be put on the list. Okay, well, a widow by definition had been married. So that really doesn't make any sense. Now, some think Paul is here excluding from serving as an elder anyone who remarried after a spouse's death, whereas others think it's excluding only those who remarried after a divorce. So you have two kind of takes on the remarriage. He's excluding people who remarried. Some say who remarried after a spouse's death. Others say no, only those who remarried after a divorce. But neither of those seems likely to me. I mean, excluding a man from serving as an elder because of remarriage after being widowed, I mean, that would be strange, given that remarriage in such cases is clearly permitted. You see, for example, in Romans 7, 1-3, 1 Corinthians 7, 8 and 9, 1 Corinthians 7, 39 and 40, and remarriage is affirmatively encouraged. In 1 Corinthians 7, verses 8 and 9, where he's dealing with widowers and widows, and in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14, where he's dealing with the younger widows. So why would it then be disqualifying? It's affirmatively encouraged, it's recognized, it's permitted. Moreover, in the parallel, again, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9, the effect would be that Paul in 1 Timothy 5:14, where he tells the younger widows to marry, he would then be telling them to do what would exclude them from eligibility on the list. You see, in the event that second husband died, they would have disqualified themselves from being on the widow's list. So that just doesn't seem to me to be the right way of looking at this. Now, excluding a man from serving because of a remarriage after a divorce that left him free to remarry. You see, that left him free to remarry, well, that would be strange for the same reason. I mean, if the remarriage is permissible in the eyes of God, it is not a reflection at all of a poor character or a lack of faith when a man avails himself of that right that is given to him by God. Now, a man who impermissibly remarried, one who remarried who had no right to remarry, would be in a different light. But I don't think Paul is here in saying this, that he must be the husband of one wife. I don't think Paul is focusing on remarriage. Okay, rather with the majority of scholars, I think the requirement is that the man be faithful to his wife, that he not have broken faith with her, which understanding is reflected in the New English Bible, which renders it faithful to his one wife, and in the NIV, the 2011 NIV, which renders it faithful to his wife. You see, just as one can express the phrase, a diamond of 1 carat, you can express that phrase as a 1 carat diamond. Just as you can do that, one can express the phrase, a man of one woman, you can express that as a one woman man, or the husband of one wife as a one wife husband. You see, when you put it that way, you see that the requirement deals with the man's character. It's the kind of person that he is. He's a one woman man. He's a one wife husband. You see, it's the type of person he is rather than his status. And I think that's the right way to understand it. George Knight, in his commentary, he cites C.H. Dodd, who says the natural meaning of mias gunaikas aner, this one woman man, or the husband of one wife, he says is surely, as Theodore of Mopsuestia says, a man who, having contracted a monogamous marriage, is faithful to his marriage vows. Okay, that faithfulness to his spouse. He says excluding alike polygamy, concubinage, and promiscuous indulgence. And then George Knight adds, promiscuous indulgence would encompass Jesus' words on wrongful divorce and remarriage in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9. So I think that's what's going on, and I think that's the better way of understanding it. But as I say, this is the most controversial. And this requirement, by the way, it makes clear that the office of overseer, this office is restricted to men, as does the earlier indication that leadership authority in the church is limited to men, as we saw in chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. And the restriction of the office of elder, that leadership office, is implied from the requirement that the candidate for being an elder be skillful in teaching. That's a task that in the assembly is done only by men, as we saw in chapter 2, verse 12. And I also think that it's restricted to men is suggested by the fact he says that he's not to be violent. All right, now that's a sin to which men are particularly vulnerable. I understand there could be some women who were violent, but by and large, that's a sin that men are particularly caught in. So he says, for the first requirement, he says, the husband of one wife. And then he says that he's to be self-controlled. An elder must be a man who is self-controlled, somebody who's disciplined. He's not somebody who's hostage to emotions and impulses. And that's to be a quality of all Christians, but it's essential for those who would serve as leaders in the Christian community, that they be self-controlled. And he lists sensible. An elder must be sensible, meaning he must be reasonable, prudent, thoughtful. We might say he must have his head on straight. This is related to self-control. I mean, the sensible person is somebody who carefully considers things for the purpose of taking responsible action. He's reflective, he's thoughtful, and then takes action based on that. The elder must be respectable. An elder must live a well-behaved and virtuous life so as to be regarded as respectable by others. His life is to be a life that is worthy of respect, and the elder is to be hospitable. Now, hospitality is, of course, that's required of all believers. You see in Romans 12:13, 16:23, and elsewhere. But it's an essential characteristic for elders. As William Mount says in his commentary, he says, overseers must be the type of people who will gladly welcome people into their homes. As Knight asserts, he who must teach others and take care of and exercise oversight over them must be open and loving to them. Elders, Paul says, they must be skillful in teaching. And this requirement of being skillful in teaching, here in 1 Timothy 3:2, it's put more fully in Titus chapter 1, verse 9. And Paul tells Titus there that an elder must be holding firmly to the faithful word according to the teaching, the apostolic doctrine, so that he may be able both to exhort with sound teaching and to refute those who contradict it. Now, in these days, modern times, long after the completion of the canon, we might say that an elder must be a man of the book. That might be how we would put it. He must have a sound grasp of Christian theology. He must understand apostolic doctrine that is fundamental to his role. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, you can translate that a couple of ways. You can translate it as, let the elders who have led well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Or you could translate it, let the elders who've led well be considered worthy of double honor, that is, those who labor in preaching and teaching. See, in the second rendering, in the second understanding there, leading well is defined as, it means laboring in preaching. And that's what it means to lead well, is you're laboring in preaching and teaching. But either way, either of those understandings highlights the importance of this aspect of the elder's role. And the word labor, that implies vigorous effort. Laboring in preaching and teaching. So that's something that they spend time doing. It is significant. It is important. Now, this does not mean that an elder must be a Bible, quote, scholar. It doesn't mean that. And the teaching that he's to do can be done in more personal settings than a classroom. But elders necessarily are able to teach and are involved in doing so in their caring for the flock. That is an indispensable aspect of their caring for the flock. They are building them spiritually. They are making them solid in Christian truths. And they are defending them from those who would warp those truths. That's important. If a man cannot communicate God's word, if he cannot communicate apostolic doctrine, he shouldn't be considered as an elder. That's a fundamental thing. Paul says that an elder is not to be given to drunkenness. An elder cannot have that as his particular area of weakness. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that Christians who are not elders are free to get drunk. Right? I mean, drunkenness is a sin. That's all over. You see Romans 13:13, Galatians 5:21, Ephesians 5:18, 1 Peter 4:3, and we could find many other places. Drunkenness is sinful, but it means this cannot be an elder's particular area of weakness. So he's somebody who's not given to drunkenness. He's not violent, but gentle. An elder is not somebody who resorts to physical force or threats of physical force, trying to intimidate people that way to get his way. He's not a bully. You see, on the contrary, he's gentle in his dealing with other people. Paul says that an elder is not contentious. So this is similar. He's not to be contentious. He's not to be a contentious, quick-tempered person. He's not combative. He's not a person who's itching for an argument or a conflict. Just can't wait to get into some kind of quarrel or fight or argument, this kind of thing. As John Stott puts it in his commentary, he says, his, meaning the elders, his patience may be sorely tried by demanding and aggravating people. Well, that's us. You see, he says his patience may be sorely tried by demanding and aggravating people, but like his master, he will seek to be gentle, never crushing a bruised reed or snuffing out a wick that is burning low. So not a contentious, quarrelsome, combative, angry person. That is not somebody who has any business serving as an elder. He says that an elder is he's not to be loving money, not somebody who is a lover of money. See, in contrast to the false teachers who had a real attraction to money, as you see in 1 Timothy 6:5 and 2 Timothy 3:2. See, in contrast to the false teachers, an elder cannot be a lover of money. Somebody who's greedy for money. If money is too important to him, he'll wind up serving money rather than serving Christ. As Jesus said in Matthew 6:24. You see, no one can serve two masters. And that's what will wind up happening. He'll wind up serving money rather than Christ. Now, all Christians are to keep their lives free of the love of money and are to be content with what they have. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. But it's essential for one who would serve as an elder. He cannot have money be too important to him. Okay, that doesn't mean he lives in a gravel lot. But he can't be a lover of money, because that is a great danger, because it can then pull you in directions you should not be pulled. He says of the elder that he's to be managing his household well. He must manage his own household well, which includes seeing that his children obey him with proper respect. And the reason is that one who's unable to manage his own family properly, well, he can't be expected to care properly for God's church. If he can't generate, instill, inspire obedience and respect in his own children, well, he's unlikely to be able to inspire and instill and generate obedience and respect for him as a leader of God's people. You see, he will be ineffective. And so that's what's going on there. Now, Paul seems to assume here that an elder will be married and will have children. Paul assumes that's the case. Now, some think this means that an elder must have more than one child. You see, because he says children, plural, but that strikes me as a hyper-literal reading of it. You see, if someone asked a group of which I was a part, how many of you have children? If somebody asked that, I would raise my hand, even though I have only one child. You see, I would assume that the question covered those with one or more children, even though it was framed in the plural. So that's how I just think that's a hyper-literal reading. In fact, in 1 Timothy 5:4, Paul says, "But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let these first learn to be religious toward their own family and to repay their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God." Now, certainly that doesn't mean that the only child of a widow has no obligation to care for, that a child must have siblings to come within the scope of Paul's command there in 1 Timothy 5:4. And that idea is supported by what he says in 1 Timothy 5:8, which says that if anyone does not provide for his own, especially his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So I think attempts to say that the elder must have more than one child, as I say, I just think they're hyper-literal, and I think they miss the point. He says next that an elder cannot be a recent convert. Now, no doubt a recent convert, of course there's some question, well, how do you define recent? Okay, well that's an ambiguity. What does it mean recent? It's not a deadline. It has something to do with development and maturity. But he says he's not to be a recent convert. Certainly a recent convert doesn't know enough about the Christian faith to function effectively or properly as an elder. But that's not how Paul explains the requirement. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, he says an elder can't be a recent convert lest, having become conceited, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. And I think the point Paul is making is that one who receives too much responsibility too soon, that person is more likely to become conceited, to get a big head, like the false teachers, by the way. You see in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 4. And an inflated ego, this idea of seeing oneself greater than one is, that leads readily to condemnation. That's a way to get quickly on the path to condemnation, because a prideful person, a know-it-all, relishes cutting his own theological trail. Because he knows more than everybody. He's puffed up. He thinks he knows everything. So he's more prone, to cut his own theological trail and refuses to accept correction. So when he goes off and starts dabbling in what is not orthodox, and someone tries to correct him, no, I know more than you. I know everything. So then you get all of these weird false ideas. You see, that come from people who are puffed up and think too much of themselves and don't see themselves doing theology within a long historical stream. They come up with all these new ideas they think are great, but they're false. And so that's what I think he's saying there. That's where the danger lies. And he says, next he says he has a good reputation with those outside. And he's referring to those outside the church. So an elder must not only be above reproach within the community of faith, must not only be above reproach there, he also must have a good reputation with non-Christians, with those outside the church. And Paul adds the reason, he says, lest he fall into disgrace and the trap of the devil. Now, one who has a bad or poor reputation among outsiders, you see, they look at him as a fraud, a cheat, a poser, a money grubber. They look at him poorly. A person who has a bad reputation among outsiders, that person can easily fall into disgrace. That person can incur slander. Either because unsympathetic outsiders, those who look at you and have already decided you're somebody who's, like I say, a crook, a cheat, somebody like that, those kinds of people will put the most unfavorable interpretation on the slightest word or deed. If they view you through the lens of a bad reputation, they think you're a bad guy and a bad actor. Well, they will be quick to spin whatever you do in a negative way. Or if they have a bad understanding or you have a bad reputation among those outside, they will be motivated to expose the particulars of your bad reputation. Why do you have a bad reputation? Well, they will want to publicize that because they see you as a crook or a liar or a cheat or a poser, whatever it is. So they will want to do that. And for the church or its leaders to be disgraced is to fall into the devil's trap. You see, so that's what Paul is talking about there, I'm convinced. Now, he goes on in verses 8 to 13, and he speaks about deacons. And he says, deacons likewise are to be worthy of respect, not double-tongued, not indulging in much wine, not greedy for money, holding securely the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. Let these also first be tested. Then, if being blameless, let them serve. The wives likewise are to be worthy of respect, not slanderers, self-controlled, and faithful in all things. Let deacons be husbands of one wife, who manage their children and their own households well. For those who have served well gain a good standing for themselves and great boldness in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So Paul, he's talking about the leadership here, as I say, probably spawned by what the false teaching has done, that this crisis of leadership, whether real or anticipated, and he gives qualifications for the elders, and then he gives them for the office or the position of deacon. And you can see that this is a formal office in the church. You can see, for example, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 1. And it is the only other formal office in the church. Only one other than the office of elder / overseer / shepherd. So here he's giving qualifications for that. Now, Scripture, it nowhere defines the tasks deacons are to perform or the duties that they're to assume. And only a broad outline of their role can be inferred from various little pieces, bits of data. You can only get this broad outline. So when you think about the role of elders that is specified, what their role is, when you think about the meaning of the word deacon, which really is one who gets something done at the behest of a superior, an assistant, a servant in that way. When you think about the meaning of the word deacon, when you think about the qualifications of deacons, especially in comparison to that of elders, and when you think about the analogy of the 7 chosen to serve in Acts chapter 6, when you pull on all of those threads, it's generally understood that deacons assist the elders by accepting immediate responsibility for works that otherwise would need to be done by elders, thereby freeing the elders to devote themselves to matters on which their time is better spent. Benjamin Merkel, in his book, 40 Questions About Elders and Deacons, he says, it seems best to view the deacons as servants who do whatever is necessary to allow the elders to accomplish their God-given calling of shepherding and teaching the church. Just as the apostles delegated administrative responsibilities to the 7, so the elders are to delegate responsibilities to the deacons so that the elders can focus their efforts elsewhere. And as that role developed historically in the early church, deacons, they ministered to the needy, they visited the sick, they administered church property, they assisted at worship, and in fact, they were described as the eyes and ears of the bishop. Now, their role may have taken that particular shape because of the precedent of Acts chapter 6, and many in the early church saw those in Acts 6 as the first deacons, but their role may have taken that shape because of the precedent of Acts chapter 6 and a belief that some of the requirements of the office of deacon implied that they would have substantial contact with people and that they would have some involvement with the church's finances, the church's purse. And because deacons are assistants to the elders and their tasks and duties are not specified, they're nowhere spelled out. It's generally thought today that elders have wide latitude in defining the role of deacons in a congregation. Now, the qualifications for the office of deacon, those qualifications, you will have noticed, they overlap to some extent with the qualifications of elders. Now, deacons, he says, they must be worthy of respect. See, which parallels the requirement that the elders be respectable. The deacons, he says, are not to be double-tongued. That's what he says literally. Now, some other translations, they take that phrase and they render it sincere or not hypocritical or not deceitful or not two-faced. But they're not to be double-tongued, not indulging in much wine. You see, that parallels the requirement of elders. Not greedy for money. Again, parallels a requirement of elders. The husband of one wife. Same requirement as you see for elders, and must manage their households and children well. Again, the same requirement as for elders. Now, though they are not required, deacons are not required to be skillful in teaching as the elders are. They're not required of that. They still must have orthodox convictions. And you can see that in verse 9. They must hold securely to the mystery of the faith, meaning the truth of the gospel. See, which was a mystery that once was hidden by God, but has now been revealed by the Spirit. And in doing so, they must maintain a clear conscience, meaning they must strive to live in accordance with the ethical demands of the gospel so that their conscience is clear. They're not a poser. They're not a phony. They're striving to live that way. And as with the elders, that's the thrust of the also in verse 10, prospective deacons are to be examined or tested to see if they meet the qualifications, to see if they have what is required to serve in that position. And only those who meet those qualifications are to be appointed to the office of deacons. Now, right in the middle of this, right in the middle of the instruction about the qualifications of deacons, Paul says the wives likewise are to be worthy of respect, not slanderers, self-controlled, and faithful in all things. Now, this is an issue in the church these days, where you have some people saying, no, that women can serve as deacons. Okay, so I have more to say about this, so this is probably a good stopping point. I've rendered it wives there for a reason. I will explain that when we come back, Lord willing, next time. But thanks for watching.
Plug in to Ashby Camp's The Outlet from the church's website. Click on More, then click on Ashby Camp's website. From Ashby Camp's website, click on Audio Video. From the YouTube channel, then click on his link to YouTube. From the YouTube, hit Playlists. From the playlist, you'll see his classes. In the future, just hit the subscribe button so you will avoid having to go through all these steps. The playlist here, you can watch Ashby's classes. You can also subscribe from the home page. Also, you can just click on the Facebook page and join us at Facebook. Hit like, share with a friend. If this video's gone too fast for you, pause at any time. Look forward to see you at the out.